千里之行，始于足下. A journey of 1,000 miles begins beneath the feet. We now gather in the Tao to travel the journey together. Welcome to Tao Talks with Derek Lin, where we delve deeply into the Daodejing by Lao Zi. Daodejing, chapter 47. So we're going to begin our discussion of 47. I think you will see that chapter 47 is talking about external pursuits versus internal self-examination. And the other major thing that you're going to see is that 47 is about the Tao as the principle behind everything and what that implies. Just as you can observe the world and figure out the Tao, the reverse is also quite true. That is, the more you figure out the Tao, the more you will understand everything around you. The people, the events, what's going on in your life, everything. So here's 47. Without going out the door, know the world. Without peering out the window, see the heavenly Tao. The further one goes, the less one knows. Therefore, the sage knows without going, names without seeing, achieves without striving. So here, we actually have rhyming schemes in some of these lines. Goes rhymes with knows. We have semi-rhymes in going, seeing, and striving. This is more the exception than the norm, because when you go from one language to the other, if the original was meant to rhyme, it's rather difficult to make sure that the translated version rhymes as well. And here, the original actually does not rhyme. It's the translation that rhymes. So there's all kinds of permutations on that particular issue. But let's get into that in just a little bit. For now, I want to take everyone through the sectional analysis as we usually do. So first, I want to draw everyone's attention to lines 1 and 2. And I want to point out, as you can see in the highlights here, that there are 2 repeating characters, as you can see. So this is quite sufficient for us to conclude that lines 1 and 2 form a section by themselves. And you can also see that line 1 is basically 2 parts of 6 characters, same with line 2, whereas all subsequent lines from 3 all the way to the end, they all contain 4 characters each. So the first 2 lines are sort of a world unto its own. That is the first section. Now, when we see, whenever in the Tao Te Ching we see 8 lines, there is the temptation to conclude that it must be divided evenly into 4 parts with 2 lines each. Will that be the case here? Well, so far, this seems to support that initial idea that we have now the first 2 lines, and then the next 2 is going to be 3 and 4, and then 5 and 6, 7 and 8. Now, does that really bear out? Let's continue and see. Let's take a look at the next couple of lines and look for the repeating characters. I think you can see, you can just look at the visual image of the Chinese characters themselves, and I think you can see the repeating characters. Pretty easy to tell from 3 and 4. The first and third characters are repeated. And when we look further down to line 5, we don't see those characters being repeated anymore. Therefore, 3 and 4, they do appear to be a section on their own. What about below this? What about 5 and 6? Can we group them together? Well, between 5 and 6, notice that there are no repeating characters between those two lines. If we scan further down, though, we do see a lot more repeating characters. There they are. And again, it's the first character and the third. Those two characters reiterate from 6 to 7 to 8. Therefore, we will have to conclude that from 5 to 8, line 5 to line 8, that's actually the last section right there. So we have seen plenty of cases where a Daodejing chapter has just a couple of lines as a conclusion. Here, it's a little bit of an exception in that the concluding section is actually longer than the beginning section and the middle section. And looking at the translation here, line 5, therefore the sage, and you can just imagine colons there, and then it goes on to talk about 3 things. 不行, 不见, 不为. We'll talk about all that sequentially. We'll begin from the top. So line 1, let's talk about that. Without going out the door, know the world. So I've isolated 2 characters there, as you can see. 出户. Literally, these 2 characters mean, respectively, go out, exiting, and door. And that's translated as going out the door. The first character there, that's the character for negation. Negation meaning no or not, or none. So, not go out door without going out the door. That's how the translation is derived. So the meaning in this context, it does not mean physically going out the door, not the physical door. This is metaphorical language we're dealing with. Here, going out the door specifically is a metaphor. It means seeking spiritual answers externally, outside of oneself, in the material world. So going out the door is used as a metaphor for heading out to the material world to look for spiritual answers in the material world. So then, to be more specific, when you look at the world, when you look at people around you, if you see some of them seeking spiritual answers in the material world, what might that look like? Well, perhaps they are looking for a group to join, and they may go from group to group to look for that which they seek. They may be looking for a teacher, a master, a guru, a particular person who can bring them the answers that they've been looking for. They may be going through a lot of books. They may be studying a lot of material in order to find those answers. They may be going to different places. We'll talk more about that in order to find those answers. So those are the manifestations for seeking spiritual answers externally. So now I think we're ready to cover line 1 completely. And we're dealing with the entire line, 不出户知天下. So let's talk about that. Without going out the door, know the world. Okay, so metaphorically, what does that mean? So 出户 means going out the door, seeking material, searching through the material world for answers, 不出户知天下 is the reverse. So not going out the door, not seeking answers in the material world, instead turning your gaze within, turning your look to the inside, searching your own feelings. And what I usually say, listening for the whispers of the Tao. And sometimes I also say, listening to the voice of the inner master. The inner master is the true master. It's the voice of your intuition, the voice of the Tao within you. So because this is speaking in metaphors, I want to be very clear with everyone that this is not Lao Tzu saying that travel is a bad thing. I have actually seen people who misinterpret and believe that Lao Tzu is against travel. Nothing could be further from the truth. This is talking about being against running around all over the place, searching for answers in a fruitless quest. That is not, definitely not, the enriching experience of traveling and learning by going to a place you haven't been to before, by gathering new experience, by seeing how other people live, and seeing the world as they do. That is very enriching. That is in accordance with the Tao. That's not what we're talking about here. What we are talking about here is the following. The unwise look for answers in the material world. They may visit distant lands and holy sites, assuming the answers must be out there somewhere. On the other hand, the wise realize the real answers are within, so that's where they conduct their search. And when they connect with the Tao, they, in turn, will gain insights about the world. So we're not quite done with all the ramifications of this line that's actually very deep and profound, because we do have people, we do know people who go all over the place, who travel to faraway lands, thinking that they can find the answer somewhere else. And a lot of that is tinged with the idea, with the illusion that the grass is greener on the other side. So the further away the grass is, the greener it must be. And if it's on the other side of the world, it must be the greenest grass available. When they get there, though, invariably they get disappointed, because the real answer is on the inside, not on the other side of the world. 不出户知天下. So this is about the internal versus the external. Now there's a story that illustrates this idea, this concept about the internal search versus an external search is not unique to the Tao or even to Asian cultures. This is worldwide. This is part of human nature, because we all have a tendency, east or west, to waste our time in the material world looking for stuff. Now, I want to share a story with everyone about that. It's called the Streetlight Effect. This is actually terminology that is used in academia as well. This is something that's tied to a type of observational bias. I will explain. First, the story, the Streetlight Effect. It goes like this. One night, I saw a man who seemed quite drunk. I saw that he was looking around for something in the illuminated area under a street light. He stumbled around. He stumbled this way and that. His footing was unsteady because he was so drunk. Wishing to be helpful, went up to him and asked, "Hey, sir, are you okay? What's going on? What are you doing?" The drunk man said, looking at me through his drunken eyes, "I'm looking for my keys. I lost my keys. And I gotta find them so I can go home." I said, "Oh, I see. Okay, well, no problem. Let me help you find your keys." So together, we looked all around the illuminated area of the street light. We looked on the ground, we looked everywhere, but we couldn't find anything. After extensive search, quite some time, we both came up empty-handed. The keys were nowhere to be found. Feeling somewhat puzzled, I asked him, "Are you quite sure, sir, that you dropped your keys around here?" The drunk man said, "What? Oh, no, of course not. I dropped the keys somewhere over there, in the park over there." This surprised me. I said, "Well, if you dropped your keys over there, why are you searching here?" And the drunk man said, "Well, obviously, because this is where the light is. This is what we can actually see. It's dark over there, it's light over here." So that is the story, or actually a well-known joke, of the Streetlight Effect. Sometimes it is called the drunkard's search, a type of observational bias. The idea is that people only search for something where it is easiest to look. And if you think about the first line of this chapter of the Daodejing, that's exactly what this is. People are searching for answers in the material world because they think it is easiest to look there. It's illuminated. But the keys aren't there. Well, that's besides the point. It's easy. Now, there are variations to this. This is something that's been taught in academia for many years. It is something that went back at least to the 1920s. It has been used, this very metaphor, this example has been used in the social sciences since at least 1964. And there are variations being told about this. So I know Dr. Wayne Dyer, before he passed away, when he gave talks, he would sometimes used this story or variation thereof to talk about why it is important to look inward, to look inside your heart instead of running all over the place in the material world looking for answers where they don't exist. So the variations on this particular story include the narrator is sometimes a policeman. And sometimes instead of the keys being dropped, being lost in the park where it's dark, it's dropped or lost in the house where it's dark. So let's go ahead and be explicit about the different elements of the metaphor, break them down one by one. The drunk man, who does that represent? Who does that symbolize? Well, it represents the spiritual seeker. It represents you and me. It represents everybody who has even a passing interest in spiritual matters, who would like to get to know themselves better, seeking spiritual answers. Therefore, the search for the keys from the story is actually the spiritual quest. That's what it stands for. The narrator, or in some variations, a policeman, well, that is a helpful friend or observer. And it is also you and me when we look at the story from a detached perspective. The lost keys, what about those? Well, in our case, it's easy to see the lost keys represent the Tao. It is what we're searching for, and therefore, it would not do us a whole lot of good to be searching for something like the Tao in the material world. Under the street light, that represents most of the time where people look. Maybe they decide to travel far away to Asia to quote unquote find themselves, to search for those inner spiritual answers. But that's still the material world. The answers aren't there. The park where the keys are actually dropped, well, that's where you really have to do the search, and that's within the heart, the human heart, your heart and mine. So this applies universally. So this is not a traditional Chinese story from ancient Chinese history, but it fits with what we're talking about really well. Let's continue with the Daodejing. Now we have a couple more characters to single out and highlight. The pinyin that you see here is misleading. It's actually 亏有. 亏有. Now, it's okay if you don't catch the pronunciation because these two characters are no longer used in modern Mandarin. What they really mean, though, 窥 means to peer out, like, looking through a keyhole, looking through a small opening, that's 窥. And then 有, no longer used in modern Mandarin, it means window, like a relatively small window. So the idea is that when you're looking out a small opening, you can't see the whole picture. That's the main idea. It is specifically about a narrow, limited view you get when you peer through a small window. So I'm just saying the same thing in a different way. The metaphor is an emphasis on not getting the whole picture. I think everybody got that point. So we'll go ahead and move on. So just as before with line 1, we're now going to go from just these two characters from the entirety of line 2. 不窥有见天道, without peering out the window, see the Heavenly Tao. Now, we've already figured out that line 1 is not literally about the physical door that you go out of. So you can guess that the window that you peer out of, that also is not physically, literally what this line is referring to. It is still metaphorical language, and we'll talk about what that means in just a minute. So here again, let's talk about the unwise and the wise. The unwise look at the small piece of the sky that they can see through the window and assume they know it all. Haven't we all seen that in some of the people around us? They have a little bit of knowledge, and it causes them to assume they know a lot. And this can be especially true for those who are limited to book knowledge. Now, the wise, on the other hand, are those who can see the entire sky, so they know what heaven is like, what the sky is like, without needing the limited view through the window. So this is about the expanded perspective versus the limited, narrow perspective. So for those people, they learn not just from academic sources, like books, reports, material like that, but also life itself. So I want to provide some additional context around what this means, let me also say that you can interpret line 2 in a variety of different ways. In line 1, we talked about how the door that it talks about, the third character in line 1, not a physical door, but a metaphorical exit point to the material world. So here in line 2, the third character, yo, it doesn't mean a physical small window, which is what the character was used to describe in ancient times. What it can metaphorical mean is if you think about, for instance, the eyes. When you look out through your eyes at the world, you think you see what you see, but as we're going to talk about later on, what you see can be misleading. So think of the windows as possibly standing in for the human eyes, the human visual perception. Now, let's bring it back. Let's bring it back to knowing and not knowing, or seeing a wide open space of the sky above versus a tiny piece of it, leading to ignorance. So here's the comparison and contrast. In terms of the Tao of Knowing, I want to set what most people see versus what Tao cultivator will also see. So the majority of the people see the small. What I mean by that is that they can fixate on the petty matters of life. They focus on the personal. That's what they care about themselves, about their little sphere of influence. So the small is the petty or the personal. The Tao cultivator sees the personal, the small, no doubt about that, but the Tao cultivator also sees the great. By the great, I mean the overall applicable principle, the Tao itself that applies to any situation. The effect of Tao cultivation in one's life is that you gain visibility to the great, the grand, not just the small, not just the details, but also the big picture. Then, most people see the immediate, what is happening now, what is happening to them, what is close by, what is near. Tao cultivators can see that, but also see the distant, that they have their view or their vision further out. They can see not just the big picture, but also how things will look when you project out in time to the future, into the future. Most people see the surface, the facade, the veneer, surface appearance. Whereas Tao cultivator sees not just the surface, but also the view from within, that is the insight. And the word insight literally means the view from within. So not just looking at how it appears externally, but also how things really are on the inside. And then finally, most people see a partial view, limited perspective. Tao cultivators learn to integrate multiple perspectives and therefore see a more complete view. A more complete view is much more likely to be the truth. So in all of this, I want to emphasize that when things happen, when events occur, to a lot of people, it may seem like there's no rhyme or reason. That is just a random occurrence. Tao cultivators will look at the same thing and realize that there's some kind of cause and effect at work, even if it's unclear exactly what all the causes are. Just the realization that there are causes associated with the effect would be sufficient for the Tao cultivator to see more, to uncover more. When most people see something happening, they may assume that it's just a single occurrence, a unique occurrence. A Tao cultivator will look at that occurrence and then consider the possibility of universal application. That is, there's some principle behind it, perhaps natural laws, that can be equally applied everywhere. So the laws of gravity, as an example, will cause things to fall here, but not only that, cause things to fall everywhere. That's easy to see in the material sense, like with gravity, harder to see when you try to apply that to human interactions. Now, this whole idea of seeing something and being able to apply universally, being able to extend what you observe to cover more than what you can see, this is a very old concept in the Tao. Goes back to the concept of guan, to observe, and then it goes from there to rationality, li you, and then it goes from there to conclusion, to knowing more about the world than you can possibly see at a glance. There's poetry from the Tang Dynasty that expresses this kind of knowing. There is a line that I find especially applicable. I would like to share that with you. Here's what it looks like. 一叶落，知天下秋. What does that mean? Let me translate it for you. It means see one leaf falling and realize autumn has arrived. And again, this is metaphorical language. It basically expresses the idea that you observe what's happening in the world and you can figure out what's happening in the world that you are not observing just by that observation. So here, 一叶落, literally that's one leaf falling. 知, know, 天下, the world, 秋, autumn. So I find that this is a very easy way to consider this idea, the Tao of knowing. It isn't just what's in front of you, but what you can infer, what you can deduce, what you can figure out about the greater world. So some pretty powerful ideas here that we ought to adopt and apply to our own lives. Now let's continue with the Daodejing. 其出彌遠, the further one goes. This requires more explanation, just like lines 1 and 2 are mostly metaphorical, requiring some explanation and understanding of the Tao mindset. This here is the same way. This means ranging far and wide in seeking knowledge. So on the surface, that seems to be pretty good, but here I want to caution everyone, don't just see it for the physical implication, for the physical world meaning. It's metaphorical, so you have to extend beyond that. In this context, 远, last character there, meaning far, refers to not just physical distance, but going further in terms of doing more work, spending more time, sampling opinions, considering theories, etc. So this is all related. It's all depicting a mindset of looking for answers all over the place in many different sources. So the sages have long observed that this is what many people do. but it is not effective. It can be counterproductive. It's counterproductive when the emphasis is on gathering a large quantity of information rather than seeking the best possible information, the most accurate information. That's how it can be counterproductive. This is true in ancient times as it is today. Human nature hasn't changed. There are still people who will mistake having a huge amount of information as representing actual knowledge. There are thick books, the vast majority of the pages no one ever reads, but then carrying around that thick, heavy book seems to be a demonstration of knowledge, but it's actually not. From personal experience, I know years ago, I had a friend who knew that I was working on Daodejing, annotated and explained, the translation. So we're talking about more than 20 years ago now. So working on this, I had a friend who was well-meaning, who wanted to help. He found a webpage that collects dozens of translations of chapter 1 of the Daodejing. Only one chapter, but it was a collection of all the translations available at that time. So he was very excited. He sent it to me right away. He meant well. But later on, when he was looking for similar information to help me, I had to tell him gently that it was actually not helpful. The very reason why I needed to write a book was because most of the translations out there contain some distortions to a greater or lesser extent. And I had to explain that in most cases, the distortions, it did not represent a different opinion on how a line should be translated. In many cases, it was simply an error in understanding, a misunderstanding of the original, which I understood because it is extremely rare to find people who can work with the ancient text easily as they can with modern Mandarin. But this was my personal encounter with this idea that when people work really hard to gather a lot of information, but the vast majority of that information, 99% of it, is junk, it becomes a counterproductive waste of time. So this is the insight that Lao Tzu already had 2,500 years ago. He was right. And as I live my life, I see that he is more correct than he knew. He probably never imagined that his words would prove to be accurate 2,500 years later. Let's continue on to line 4. Line 4 is a continuation of the same train of thought, that when you have quantity, when you accumulate more and more, it leads to more and more confusion. So I knew how to read and understand ancient text, but a lot of people that didn't have that background would look at the massive collection of different translations and be totally confused. It's certainly not the best way to find spiritual truths. In a similar way, in daily life, you can easily find people who seem to know it all. And in fact, you may refer to them as, that person, he's the know-it-all. You know how they are. They can cite facts, trivia, they can ramble on and on about a particular subject, and yeah, this may seem pretty impressive at first. People may look at this person and say, wow, he's really smart. He knows all these big words. He knows all these obscure facts that nobody even suspected, were that way. So impressive, right? According to Lao Tzu, wrong. Indeed, after a while, you will probably notice such people can't seem to get to the point. You listen to them for a while and you start to get impatient. So what's the point? Can you get to the point? Come on, what is the point? Or, very common, they can lose track of their train of thought. They started out talking about one thing, they veer off into a different subject, and then another, and then another. Before you know it, the original question or the original idea was already lost forever. Or when they do have a conclusion, when they do make a point, you may notice that their ideas are impractical, not realistic. And sometimes we'll say they've got their head in the clouds. Their ideas are not usable, not pragmatic. At some point, people turn their attention to those who have actual ideas that can work. So all of this that I'm describing, these are all the opposite of wisdom. These are the unwise that may appear knowledgeable, but is actually not. Okay, so let's continue on with the Daodejing. Line 5, I'm jumping over that, but I'll talk about it quickly. Therefore, the sage. That's a straight translation here of the 4 characters. The first 2 characters in line 5 translate to therefore, thus, so. It's one of those 3 possibilities. That's it. You can't really translate it in other ways. Those are the possible ways to translate. Then we have the familiar 圣人. That is a person who is so wise that the wisdom approaches the divine. So the sage is also the wise. In lines 6, 7, and 8, these lines describe the disposition, the inclination, the preference, the likely behavior of the sages, the characteristics of the sages, the style, if you will. We start with line 6. 不行而知, knows without going. So this is a reiteration of the idea that we talked about at the beginning, that not leaving, not going out the door, know the world. This is a reiteration of that. It's expressing the same idea. And again, this is not about being against the broadening experience of traveling. Instead, this is about the fruitless search in different places for spiritual truths. So let's get into this more deeply. I specifically want to talk about regions of the world, especially Asia, which seems to be shrouded in sort of a mystique. So mysterious, this veil of mystery, this exotic allure, right? People associate or assume special attributes with that. And it's due to the exotic appeal of faraway places. So you can see how this ties in so well with the previous chapter when I talked about how the world has the Tao. Sometimes it does, sometimes it does not. Today, you know, if you travel far away to Asia expecting to find the Tao, you may be disappointed at the macro level. When you get to know, and here's the truth, by the way, no matter where you go, when you get to know the people on a personal level, when you make friends with people, you can find the Tao pretty much anywhere. Now, if you're looking for an entire society where you can find the Tao that is pervasive, there are only very few societies today in the world that can demonstrate that. Previously, I mentioned Japan and Taiwan as being 2 good examples, but they're rare examples. So sages know that wisdom is not tied to a particular area or a particular country. It is also not tied to certain buildings. And here I'm talking about, you know, houses of worship, churches, temples, and so on. And this is true regardless of reputation. It doesn't matter if a particular place, a region of the world, or a particular temple, it can be imposing, it can be impressive. That's all fine. But that doesn't mean you're going to find the Tao there. In fact, I would say you most certainly will not find the Tao. Let's go to the next one. Names without seeing. So, 不见而名, number 7. What does that mean? This is where we start to talk about how seeing may not be believing. And what do I mean by that? Well, first of all, let me pull up the bullet here. People tend to rely on what they see. And I want to remind everyone that we have a lot of expressions that contribute to this idea. People rely on what they see. For instance, we say things like, see for yourself. And we say things like, seeing is believing. These are common expressions. They all basically reinforce this idea that if you see something, then you can believe it, then it must be true, right? Therefore, you have to see for yourself. So from the Tao perspective, we ought to dig deeper than that. When you go deeper, though, you can see that human sight can be fooled in a number of ways. It can be misdirected, and there can be optical illusions. Your memory of what you have seen can be distorted, and so on. Now, obviously, I have just uncovered a topic that has a whole discussion associated with it, and I can see also that we have we're actually approaching the end of our time together today. Just like before, time flies when you're having fun. Time flies when we delve into the Tao. So for the more complete expression on what we see versus the truth, we should do that next time. There is a whole lot to talk about. And then, of course, at the very end of our discussion, we still have to do the paraphrase, the full circle, and so on. For now, though, we should do the summary for 47. And the summary, of course, is always about applying the Daodejing. Here, I want to take a couple of lines and ask you to apply these lines in your life. First, line 1, 不出户，知天下. So question, this is from the angle of keeping informed. It is a good thing for all of us to stay informed on what's happening in the world. But the question is this, what is the balance between that, being informed, and following the news with too much of an obsessive behavior, obsessively following the news? Can that happen? Yes, it can. It's happened to me. I am not proud to admit it. It's definitely happened, where I am just completely obsessive in following the news. I don't actually need to do that to understand what's going on in the world. Then, another angle on this is the internal versus the external, that when you know the internal, when you turn your gaze inward and you understand yourself, then by extension, you can figure out what's going on with other people. So the question is, what are some things you can understand about others by knowing yourself better? I'll give you one example. When I turn the gaze inward and when I examine myself, I see that in social interactions, invariably I create a facade fitting the moment, whether it is as as a professional in the workplace, or as a playing a role with with my nieces, nephews, with my relatives, etc., with my parents. So when I create a surface level facade, I can expand from there to realize that everyone has to do this. I do it. Everyone is doing this. What they're showing me may not be what's actually going on. Then the realization is that people really are constantly doing the best they can with what they have. It's just that sometimes they don't have a whole lot. So before, I was very harsh, judgmental on people. Now, when I realize this, I see that if people are not measuring up, they're doing the best they can. I need to cut them some slack. So that's one example of how you can go from the internal to the external. What about line 2? Well, for line 1, I want to leave you with the keys as a graphic, as a visual reminder of this whole idea, the internal to the external. Remember the story of the drunk man searching for the keys under the illuminated area of the streetlight, and compare that to the search for truths in the material world. Now, line 2. 不窥有见天道. Well, in the past, let me ask everyone to think about this. Have you ever experienced a realization that brought with it a cascade of insights? That realizing one thing brought about realization for more things, further realizations, deeper, clearer realizations? That's what we're talking about here. And then also look toward the future. What are the areas of exploration, hopefully in the Tao, where you can, that perhaps will bring about similar breakthroughs, realizing one thing, bringing about additional realizations, additional ideas, clarity, deeper understanding, all of that. For that, I would like to leave you with this beautiful leaf from, since we're now entering foliage season, this is especially fitting. I want to ask everyone to use that as your visual cue to remember this whole idea that when you see one such falling leaf, you can know that autumn has arrived all over. Our meeting has come to an end, but the journey continues on. Let us travel safely. Until next time, may the Tao fill you with peace and happiness.